Hello, everybody. Welcome to Kinzy's Crime Time with me, Katie Kinsey. Hi. This is technically the second episode. However, the first episode has been lost forever. I have no idea what happened to it, which makes me a little sad because that was about the Black Dahlia. Obviously, if you're sensing a theme and you see the ticker at the bottom here, this is a show that I do where I talk about true crime, whether that's unsolved murders, serial killers, this kind of being a little bit of both, possibly being solved this year. I will also say that I started doing the research on this back in October. It is now February. Lots of things happened. Yeah, life. But I'm here now and I'm doing it, and I think I picked a perfect time because once I talk about suspects at the end, we may have had a huge break in this case. So, Jack the Ripper. Probably one of the most well-known serial killers in history, dare I say. Some consider him to be the first serial killer. So, this was in the East End of London back in 1888. So, Jack the Ripper had the Whitechapel murders. All of his murders took place within Whitechapel. Canonically, there are 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, but I will be talking about 2 other victims that may or may not be victims of Jack the Ripper. Also, I'm putting this out there now, there's a lot of graphic details in this stuff. I am not shying away from anything. Everything I have read and seen, we will be talking about it. It is a lot of stuff. A lot of very gruesome, a lot of dark, bad things that he did. But let's start with Emma Smith. She was the first Whitechapel victim, but not Jack's victim. So I know that might be a little confusing. So this was earlier in the year of 1888, April 2nd to be exact. So this was before we get to the Whitechapel murders in the later end of 1888. But Emma Smith, she was 45 years old, widow, and a lady of the night. That will be said a lot in this video. Lots of ladies of the night, or women perceived to be ladies of the night. So, Monday, April 2nd, 1888, she goes out for the evening. She's seen by Margaret Hayes talking to a man in dark clothing and a white neckerchief early Tuesday morning. So, we'll say between 4 and 5 in the morning, because Smith returned to the lodging house she was staying at between 4 and 5 a.m. April 3rd. Mary Russell, who was living at the lodging house, said her face was bleeding, her ear was badly cut, and she was also injured in the lower part of her body. Smith said that she was, quote, shockingly mistreated by some men. And they said she was robbed, or she said she was robbed, and she couldn't identify her attackers. Russell persuaded Smith to go see the doctor and walked with her. Portion of her right ear was torn. Other internal organs were ruptured. The injuries were too severe. She slipped into a coma and succumbed to her injuries April 4th. So that's the first instance that Whitechapel saw of a gruesome attack. This was not an imminent death. She didn't die right there and then. She just sadly succumbed to her injuries 2 days later. Now, the next victim could have been the first actual victim of the Ripper. Again, canonically there are 5. She may have been the actual first. Martha Trebram was a 39-year-old woman with a drinking problem, and again, a lady of the night. So we've moved a few months here. We're in August 2nd, 1888, which we're into the canonical 5. Mary Nichols was our first actual victim of the Ripper. She had alcohol issues, again, a lady of the night. August 30th, she was seen walking on Whitechapel Road. An hour later, Nichols was seen leaving the Frying Pan pub. turned away from the lodging house she was staying at due to insufficient funds. That also was a theme for a lot of the women as well, staying in lodging houses together. Because again, they were ladies of the night. They didn't have a lot of money. They were trying to just stay afloat. But she was turned away. Emily Holland, who was sharing her bed with Nichols at the lodging house, met up with her that night. Around 2:30, the ladies had a conversation and parted ways. About an hour later, August 31st, Charles Cross left his house to head to his job. He was a delivery man. Passing through Bucks Row, he noticed a dark bundle lying on the ground. Thought it was a tarpaulin, which is a large sheet waterproof material, and thought it could be useful for his job, which, fair. People do that all the time. He walked over and realized there was a woman lying on her back, her legs straight, skirt pulled up almost over her waist, much like to Bram earlier. Robert Paul was walking the same route, and Cross called him over, checked her breathing, said, quote, "I think she's breathing, but very little if she is." From this point on, we will notice people and police and things happening to crime scenes and to the victims that could have helped solve this a long time ago. They pulled her skirts down to her knees and then they just left. That was it. Didn't call the police. Didn't say anything. They said, "Oh no, yeah, she's breathing." Pull her skirts back down and leave. Thankfully, Police Constable John Neal walked by shortly after Cross and Paul left the scene. He saw the figure, same figure lying on the ground, saw blood oozing out from a wound around the throat, eyes wide, bonnet off, and lying on her side. So, like, you're telling me these guys didn't notice that or they didn't care? That's wild. The coroner did suggest that she had been dead no more than a half hour due to her upper extremities being warm. The back of her clothes were drenched in blood. If she was on her back and her throat was slit, that makes sense. A small amount of blood at the scene had the coroner believing she was murdered somewhere else. Again, warnings, because this is where we start to get gross. She had been disemboweled due to a large gash down her abdomen. Two workhouse paupers decided to strip the body down, throw the clothes into a pile in the mortuary yard before the medical examiner could get there. Like, why? In what world do you think it's okay to dispose of the clothing on a victim before a coroner can even get there? That's what I'm saying. There's just things like that happen throughout these gruesome ass murders. It just irritates me. I don't understand. I get it was a different time, a completely different time, like 1800s in London, but still, human decency, apparently not. We move on to the second victim, Annie Chapman. She was 47 years old, a lady of the night, and a fond lover of the drink, as it was perfectly phrased. She was living in a lodging house, much like the other victims. Got into a physical altercation a few days before her death with fellow lodger Eliza Cooper. So a little bit of violence there. Some say it was over a London bar of soap. Others say because of a man. Probably a man, if I were to guess. But I don't know. I wasn't there. A few days later, Annie meets with Amelia Palmer and shows her bruised temple and bruised chest. That is all from the fight she had with Eliza Cooper. September 8th, in the early morning, Annie is kicked out of the lodging house due to insufficient funds, and she vows to return with money to keep her bed. Again, kicked out of the lodging house, much like the previous victim. At 5:30 in the morning, Mrs. Elizabeth Long sees Miss Chapman, talking to a man outside of number 29 Hanbury Street. She heard the man say, quote, "Will you?" And Annie replying, "Yes." What that conversation entailed, we don't know. We can assume, based off her profession, That's all we can do. Quote, I think she's breathing, but very little if she is. So this point on, we will notice people and police and things happening to crime scenes and to the victims that could have helped solve this a long time ago. They pulled her skirts down to her knees and then they just left. That was it. Didn't call the police. Didn't say anything. They said, oh no, yeah, she's breathing. Pull her skirts back down and leave. Thankfully, Police Constable John Neal walked by shortly after Cross and Paul left the scene. He saw the same figure lying on the ground, saw blood oozing out from a wound around the throat, eyes wide, bonnet off, and lying on her side. So, you're telling me these guys didn't notice that or they didn't care? That's wild. The coroner did suggest that she had been dead no more than a half hour due to her upper extremities being warm. Which makes sense. The back of her clothes were drenched in blood. If she was on her back and her throat was slit, that makes sense. A small amount of blood at the scene had the coroner believing she was murdered somewhere else. Again, warnings, because this is where we start to get gross. She had been disemboweled due to a large gash down her abdomen. 2 workhouse paupers decided to strip the body down, throw the clothes into a pile in the mortuary yard before the medical examiner could get there. Why? In what world do you think it's okay to dispose of the clothing on a victim before a coroner can even get there? That's what I'm saying. There's just things like that happen throughout these gruesome ass murders. It just irritates me. I don't understand. I get it was a different time, a completely different time, 1800s in London. But still, human decency? Apparently not. We move on to the second victim, Annie Chapman. She was 47 years old, a lady of the night, and a fond lover of the drink, as it was perfectly phrased. She was living in a lodging house, much like the other victims. Got into a physical altercation a few days before her death with fellow lodger Eliza Cooper. So a little bit of violence there. Some say it was over a London bar of soap. Others say because of a man. Probably a man, if I were to guess. But I don't know. I wasn't there. A few days later, Annie meets with Amelia Palmer and shows her bruised temple and bruised chest. That is all from the fight she had with Eliza Cooper. September 8th, in the early morning, Annie is kicked out of the lodging house due to insufficient funds, and she vows to return with money to keep her bed. Again, kicked out of the lodging house, much like the previous victim. At 5:30 in the morning, Mrs. Elizabeth Long sees Miss Chapman, talking to a man outside of number 29 Hanbury Street. She heard the man say, quote, "Will you?" And Annie replying, "Yes." What that conversation entailed, we don't know. We can assume, based off her profession. That's all we can do. About a half hour later, a elder resident of 29 Hanbury Street, John Davis, opened the back door and saw Annie's body. He ran out, found 2 working men, urging them to come with him. Her body was mutilated and laying between the steps and the wooden fence of 29 Hanbury Street. Her head was turned towards the house, clothing pulled above her waist, showing her red and white stockings. A handkerchief was tied around her neck before her neck was slit. Hands and face were covered in blood. Her hands were bent with palms facing up, seeming like she was trying to stop her attacker. The men all ran to find police. Police arrived half an hour later with Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon. So now I'm going to read Dr. George Bagster Phillips' testimony from what he saw. Again, this is what he saw. This is all quoted. And again, if you're squeamish and you don't want to listen to this, warnings all around. Quote, the left arm was placed across the left breast, the legs were drawn up, the feet resting on the ground, and the knees turned outwards. The face was swollen and turned on the right side. The tongue protruded between the front teeth, but not beyond the lips. The tongue was evidently much swollen. The front teeth were perfect as far as the first molar, top and bottom, and very fine teeth they were. The body was terribly mutilated. The stiffness of the limbs was not marked, but was evidently commencing. Sorry, it's very hard for me to read. He noticed that the throat was dissevered deeply, that the incisions through the skin were jagged and reached right around the neck. On the wooden paling in the yard in question and the next, smears of blood corresponding to where the head of the deceased lay were to be seen. These were about 14 inches from the ground and immediately above the part where the blood from the neck lay. So very gruesome. This was much more aggressive than our first victim. And again, this is where it gets crazier. Post-mortem, the killer, the Ripper, took Annie's womb out. Yeah. Terrible. The body was not to be touched until after post-mortem inspection, unlike Mary Nichols' body was, which, thankfully, they said that this time. 2 hours after Inspector Chandler left, nurses who acted on instructions from the clerk of workhouse guardians stripped and washed the body before a post-mortem could be done. Almost like they completely ignored the conversation that was just mentioned before this. Because why would you... Again, in what world do you all think it's okay to do this? I don't know. I truly don't anymore. Like, I don't know. It's very sad. Honestly. Very sad. Next up, our third victim. Nicknamed Long Liz. Elizabeth Schride. 45 when she died. She was cleaning rooms at lodging house number 32 Flower and Dean Street. Lived off and on there for about 6 years. Earned 6 pence for chores. I do not know what that is equivalent to, then or now. She was a drinker and a lady of the night. Sensing a theme. She left the lodging house about 7:30 for a night out on September 29th. Was seen with a man around 11 p.m. at Bricklayer's Arms on Settle Street. Now, this is where we're starting to get descriptions of the Ripper. And you'll notice that all the descriptions, or for the most part, the majority of the descriptions people give are similar in some of the details. So, in this case, the man was described as, quote, being 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a black mustache, sandy eyelashes, and wearing a black morning coat and a billycock hat, which I believe is just like a bowler hat, if I remember correctly. Eyewitnesses say it was strange to seeing the two together, and had a laugh at the two, saying, quote, watch out, that's Leather Apron getting round you, causing the pair to leave in a hurry. I should also mention, Leather Apron was another name they were giving the Ripper in this case. I don't know why. I didn't fully look into that, but that was another name that he was given. Again, as of right now, they don't really assume it's a serial killer or that it's the same person based off the first 2 victims. So this was just people making a funny, or so they thought. It's not funny, but 45 minutes later, William Marshall saw the pair outside of number 63 Burner Street kissing, as some people do. heard the man say, quote, "You would say anything but your prayers," to the woman. And the man who saw, William Marshall, who saw them, had a similar description of the man. Quote, "Appearance of a clerk, 5 feet 6 inches, clean shaven, respectably dressed, small black cutaway coat, dark trousers, round cap with a small sailor-like peak." So again, descriptions very similar. About 12:30 in the morning, the couple was seen on the opposite side of the road to Detfield's yard. This is where her body would later be found. P.C. William Smith described the man as, quote, "approximately 28 years old with a dark complexion and small dark mustache, 5 foot 7 inches, wearing a dark overcoat, a hard felt deerstalker hat, and ark clothing." And then a woman, who was later identified as Elizabeth Stride, had a flower pinned to her jacket. I also like that William Smith said approximately 28 years old. How do you know that from looking at someone? I truly don't understand. But 30 minutes before her body was discovered, there was an eyewitness named Israel Schwartz who saw Stride with the man. It was the first time that a victim, potentially a victim, was seen in the early stages of her murder, so police took him seriously as a witness. Even though his stories were slightly different to journalists and police, he spoke no English, so his testimony was given through a translator, which can usually lead to things being misconstrued. But he had a similar description, as he described the man, quote, 5 feet 5 inches, aged around 30, with dark hair, fair complexion, small brown mustache, full face, broad shoulders, slightly intoxicated. Again, if that's what he actually said, or that's what the interpreter or translator got, we don't know. But he watched as the man tried to pull the woman into the street, threw her onto the footway. The woman screamed 3 times, but not very loudly. Schwartz thought it was a domestic dispute and didn't want to get involved, so he crossed the street. He saw a second man standing there lighting a pipe as he passed the man attacking the woman. After outrunning and escaping the man he described as, quote, aged about 35, 5 feet 11 inches, fresh complexion, light brown hair, brown mustache, wearing a dark overcoat with old black hard felt hat. That means somebody was standing there watching this happen. Schwartz showed up, and he was then chased from the scene. However, police eliminated the second man as a suspect due to lack of evidence. At about 1 a.m., Louis Diemschultz returned to Dutfield's yard as he turned his pony and cart into the yard. As he did, the pony yielded to the left and refused to go any further. Confused, he saw a dark form lying on the ground close to the wall. He tried to prod it with his whip and lift it. Which, why that's your first instinct, I don't know. When that didn't work, he jumped down and struck a match to get a better look. He saw the body, not sure if it was his wife or not, ran to the International Working Men's Educational Club to see his wife alive. He told some club members he wasn't sure if she was drunk or dead, so Lewis and the club members come out and see the body was bloody. People ran off trying to find police, shouting, quote, police, murder, as you should. They found Police Constable Edward Spooner. He lifted the woman's chin and found it to be slightly warm. Much like the other victims, her throat was cut over 2 inches wide. Doubled up in the woman's hand was a piece of paper. It was later found out to be a packet of breath fresheners. Arrived around 1:16 a.m., pronounced Elizabeth Stride dead, saying she'd been dead for about 20 to 30 minutes. They could not determine whether her throat was slit while standing or on the ground. Her excuse me, her windpipe was sliced. She was not able to scream and would have bled out within a few minutes. They checked all the people around for evidence, went around to nearby cottages, but they could not find anything. So it is, again, possible that Schwartz saw basically the time frame that Elizabeth Stride was murdered, which is insane. We're now on to our fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. So this was September 30th. So this is where things become very interesting in the case of Jack the Ripper. So around the same time that they found Elizabeth Stride's body, Catherine Eddowes was being released from Bishopgate Police Station, which is just wild. Prior to her arrest, around 8:30, she was drunk and entertaining onlookers outside number 29 Aldgate High Street. She fell asleep on the ground. They arrested her, took her to a cell to sober up. At 12:55 the next morning, she was released, where she lied to officers, saying her name was Mary Ann Kelly and she lived on 6 Fashion Street. Which, I get lying to the police in that point in time if you are a lady of the night and don't want to give them your actual information. She wanted to leave the station and get drunk again immediately, so she left and headed towards Houndsditch. According to PC George Hutt, it would have taken around 8 minutes of, quote, normal walking to reach Mitre Square, in which time the killer was heading to Mitre Square from the opposite direction. There's 3 entrances to the square. A fairly wide open one that came in from Mitre Square, the narrower St. James Place, known locally as the, quote, Orange Market, in the square's northeast corner, and the long, narrow church passage in the southeast corner that came in from Duke's Place. And every 12 to 14 minutes, P.C. Watkins passed through that square on his beat. Remember that, 12 to 14 minutes, he passed this area. 3 separate gentlemen saw a woman and a man talking together quietly. First man, Joseph Haim Levy, was convinced the couple were up to no good. He couldn't get a description of the couple, but said the man was about, quote, 3 inches taller than the woman. Very descriptive. The second of the 3 men, Joseph Laundy, caught a brief glance of the other man's face. Said he had the appearance of a sailor, about 30 years old, medium build, quote, like 5'9", with a small fair mustache. Wore a reddish neckerchief tied in a knot, wore a salt and pepper colored loose-fitting jacket, and had a gray peaked cloth cap. He did say he would probably not be able to identify the other man if he were to see him again, which is fair, especially if they were like kind of far. However, 15 minutes later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was found, meaning Lavandy saw Jack the Ripper and described him to a T as best he could. So around 1:44 a.m., P.C. Watkins, strolling through the square, he immediately saw Eddowes' body. She was lying on her back in a pool of blood with her clothes thrown over her waist. Again, the Ripper's MO at this point. Her windpipe was slit, and the coroner said the killer, quote, only had basic knowledge of anatomy. This is when we're starting to get a little bit more information of whether they think the Ripper had medical knowledge or not. Some say he did, some say he didn't. Inspector Edward Collard arrived and wanted to search the area. No one heard anything, even though it was brutal. It's insane. But this was the first time that the Ripper had left a clue. This is going to come in handy when I talk about suspects later. The only clue was a fragment of Eddowes's apron. It's also been called a shawl and a scarf. So a piece of fragment was missing. It was found in a doorway leading to stairways 108 to 119 Wentworth model dwellings. Covered in blood, feces, knife markings, the whole thing. So because of that fact, the Ripper would have had so much blood on him, on his hands and his clothes, but he could have covered it with a large coat that every eyewitness has seen him wearing. Directly above the apron was a message on the wall. And again, this is also new. We've never had this before. Quote, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." End quote. And this is the part where police like to argue on what to do. City police wanted it photographed. Metro police told them it would mean wait until sunrise, meaning people would be out, it would cause a scene, it would cause an uproar. Sir Charles Warren arrived between 5 and 5:30 in the morning and said the message should be erased immediately with no photo evidence of it, and because he didn't want to cause harm to innocent Jews, which is fair. I understand, but you still should have taken a picture of it and then erased it. I don't know. And we are on to our fifth and final victim of Jack the Ripper in the canonical five, Mary Kelly. She was the youngest. She was 25. She was also murdered November 9th. So we have about a month or so in between the fourth and fifth victim. People said she was occasionally seen tipsy, and that was really the only bad thing about her. She rented a room in Miller's Court months prior to her death. She lived there with an unemployed fish porter named Joseph Barnett. But because he was unemployed, she had to resort to being a lady of the night, which led to many arguments between them. And at one point, a pane of window glass had been broken in during one of these heated exchanges. In late October, he had a homeless lady of the night come live with them, causing Barnett to move out. He did, however, remain friendly with Mary throughout the rest of her life. And he was with her for about an hour the night before she died. So he was one of the last people to see her. Not the last. But. So around 4 a.m. on November 9th, neighbors heard cries of, quote, murder. But this was apparently common due to drunken brawls and domestic violence and all the other sorts of things that would happen during these times. So they paid no mind to it. However, at 10:45, the landlord's assistant, Thomas Bauer, was sent to collect Mary's rent. He banged on the door countless times, didn't hear anything. He peeked through the window pane that had been previously broken. What he saw was a lot of blood, so he ran back and told the landlord what he saw. The wall behind the bed was splattered with blood. A pile of bloody human flesh was on the side table. That led them to get inspectors Walter Dew and Walter Beck. Tried the door, wouldn't open. Of course, we knew that. Mary's body was on the bed, head facing the window, her eyes wide open. Barnett was only able to identify Mary by her eyes and ears. Dr. Thomas Bond did the post-mortem autopsy, and this was the report. This is a long one, so bear with me. And this is all in his report. The body was lying naked in the middle of the bed, the shoulders flat, but the axis of the body inclined to the left side of the bed. The head was turned on the left cheek. The left arm was close to the body with the forearm flexed at a right angle and lying across the abdomen. The right arm was slightly abducted from the body and rested on the mattress, the elbow bent and forearm supine with the fingers clenched. The legs were wide apart, the left thigh at right angles to the trunk and right forming an obtuse angle with the pubes. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs were removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. Everything inside of her was gone. Basically, in that area, is what he's saying. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition to the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all around down to the bone. This is by far the most gruesome one, and we have no idea why. The viscera was found in various parts. The uterus and kidneys with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. Because who the fuck does this? I still don't understand why this was the most gruesome one. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on a table. The bed clothing at the right corner was saturated with blood, and on the floor beneath was a pool of blood covering about 2 square feet. The face was gashed in all directions, the nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears being partially removed. The lips were blanched and cut by several incisions running down her chin. There were also numerous cuts extending irregularly across all of the features. Hence, why Bartnett could only identify her by her eyes. This is quite literally the most gruesome of all 5 canonical murders of Jack the Ripper. And again, we have no idea why this was the most intense, the most egregious, the most horrific. Nobody knows even to this day. But now, we're going to move on to suspects. There were over 300 people actually investigated for these crimes. Over 300. Because people were giving basic descriptions of the man seen with most of these women, which in their case were all relatively similar. So they knew the man was about anywhere between 5'5" to 5'7". The main thing was the mustache. Everyone knew the mustache. And, the clothing that he wore. However, out of the 380 people were detained in police custody. Before I get to a major suspect, I'm not going to talk about all the suspects, because again, there were quite a few. I just want to give one of my theories, which has been possibly proven wrong as of today when I saw the information that happened, which I'll talk about soon. For the longest time, might have been because of a book I read, I assumed that Jack the Ripper was H.H. Holmes. H.H. Holmes is America's first serial killer. They had, based off descriptions, the mustache, the bowler hat, the build. That's mainly what I have a lot to base off of. But it's an interesting theory because I believe everything with Jack the Ripper was first, and then he would have moved to America. So again, not saying that's true in any way, shape, or form. That's just one of the more interesting theories I have seen, and one of the ones I was always thoroughly behind, because I was like, that could be very interesting. You are the world's most notorious serial killer for that time, and you're America's first serial killer. Interesting. But the major suspect was Aaron Kosminski. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. He was a Polish Jew. He was a, quote, hairdresser, but he had not worked in quite some time. He did, however, appear in court one time prior to all of this. Actually, no, this was after the murders. I'm so sorry. In December of 1889, he was one of several people summoned for having unmuzzled dogs in public. Nothing came about that. He didn't have to stay in court or anything. He just had to show up. I don't really know what happened with all of that. But he did have a history of mental illness. Around mid 1890, he started displaying symptoms of schizophrenia and was admitted to Mile End Old Town Workhouse. He was released 3 days later. In 1891, he was readmitted again, and this time he was certified as insane, and he was transferred to the Middlesex County Lunatic Asylum at Colony Hutch. According to their books, he was 26, had a unknown illness, mental illness, but later added self-abuse to that list. Said he was not a danger to others, even though prior to this he threatened his sister with a knife. But yeah, no, definitely not a danger to others. I don't understand. He called himself a, quote, medical man. Said he knew all of the movements of mankind, and his movements were controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. I don't know. I don't know at all. And because of the mental illness, they found out that he was also eating food out of the gutter, and he wouldn't trust food coming from other people's hands. I don't know. I don't know what that entailed, but he spent 3 years in that specific facility. Quote, extremely deluded and morose, rather difficult to deal with on account of the dominant character of his delusions, incoherent, apathetic, excitable, indolent but quiet and clean in habits, dull and vacant. That's how he was described by the people of this facility for 3 years. Then he was transferred to Leavesdale Asylum, where he would spend the rest of his life, I believe it was 25 years, dying on March 24th, 1919. So during this time, they assumed this was him. There were arguments made against his guilt because he was never classed as homicidal or a danger to others. But again, he threatened his sister with a knife, so how is he not a danger to others in any way, shape, or form? I don't literally understand. But one of the interesting things that happened the past few days, we have potentially evidence that that man, Aaron Kosminski, was Jack the Ripper. So Russell Edwards, the author of Naming Jack the Ripper, bought a blood-stained Shaw in 2007 from an auction. The Shaw, the part of the Shaw, had Catherine Eddowes' DNA, and it was said to also have the Ripper's DNA on it. Which, again, remember when I said that earlier? That part is very important. So, Edwards got DNA from descendants from Kosminski's sister and a descendant of Catherine Eddowes, Karen Miller. It matched... Okay, so the DNA from the descendant of Kosminski's sister matched the DNA on the blood-stained scarf. What? 130 some years later, we may have potentially found out who Jack the Ripper was. Now we're just waiting for courts to 100% confirm everything. But what? And it was one person they suspected for the longest time. He was one of the major suspects. I was absolutely dumbfounded to figure this out. Once I figured that out, today, as I record this, is February 10th. I immediately had to finish the notes I had and upload this and record it because I'm shocked. I truly cannot believe that this has happened. Again, if it ends up being incorrect, that sucks for any descendants of the victims, if there were any. It's just, I don't know. This was not something I expected to fully find out on Monday, February 10th, 2025, but here we are. And this was it. This was all the information I had, the research I have done. Let me know who else or what else you would like to see done for Kinzy's Crime Time. And let me know if you think that this DNA actually is a match. Or are we all just being bamboozled and we actually will never know the real identity of the Ripper? Feel free to let me know in the comments below. I thank you guys for bearing with me doing this. This was a lot of information I tried to cut down as best I could. But thank you guys again so much. I hope you learned something. I sure did. And I will catch you guys next time for Kinzy's Crime Time. Bye-bye.